Well, hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Steve Sate, and I'm in the School of Biology here at the University of Leeds, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this joint seminar of the Global Food and Environment Institute and the Sustainability Research Institute. The GFEI is an interdisciplinary research community that works on food security and climate change, while the SRI conducts research on a wide range of dimensions related to sustainability. And you can find links to their websites in the meeting chat if you want to learn more about their activities. Just as a reminder, during the seminar, please can you ensure that your cameras and microphones are switched off for the duration. The presentation itself should last about 20 minutes, during which time please use the chat function addressed to everyone to pose your questions. And at the end of the presentation, there will be a 10-minute Q&A session where I will attempt to collate as many questions as I can from the chat to ask David. May I also remind you that this seminar is being recorded and a recording will be made available via YouTube. So I'm an insect ecologist and much of my research currently takes place in agricultural landscapes. So I'm delighted to chair this webinar entitled, How Can We Save Biodiversity While Feeding the World? Which will be presented by Dr. David Williams, who's a lecturer in sustainability in the environment here at the University of Leeds. So David is interested in balancing biodiversity conservation with human needs, and in particular, the role of land use strategies in the context of food production. Now, David has already told me that the talk today is deliberately slightly provocative. So the aim is really to start a conversation as much as provide a pathway to 21st century sustainability. So without further ado, I will hand you over to David.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Steve. Yeah, hopefully this isn't going to be too provocative, but 20 minutes isn't very long, and so I don't have time to put in all of the usual caveats that I would. Right, I'm talking about saving biodiversity and attempting to feed the world. So just for a bit of context, which you probably all know about, I'm talking about biodiversity and saving it because globally biodiversity isn't really doing very well at all. So loads of different metrics for this. This is the Living Planet Index, which is an aggregate measure of thousands of populations that have been measured across the world since about 1970. And as you can see, it's declined by a lot. So the average population has declined by about 68%. And this is obviously very worrying if we care about biodiversity. It's also worrying if we care about the benefits that we might get from biodiversity as well. And not only this, those declines, these biodiversity declines, are actually greatest in the parts of the world where we least want to see declines, the really high biodiversity regions. So a couple of years ago, we analysed IUCN data, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and we looked at 3 high biodiversity tropical regions, South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and tropical South America. And we just looked at the proportion of species that are threatened with extinction in these 3 regions. I'm showing you mammal data here. And as you can see, levels of threat are really very high indeed, right? Around about 60% of mammals in South and Southeast Asia and tropical South America, or sorry, large mammals, are threatened with extinction. So really, really serious declines in the parts.
Stop, can't hear you.
David, you've gone to mute.
That was awkward. I'm not quite sure I managed to do that. Sorry about that. So to recap, biodiversity declines are greatest in the most biodiverse parts of the world. So this is pretty bad news if we want to save global biodiversity. That's what I'm talking about, biodiversity. The reason I'm talking about food is not only is it obviously completely essential for human well-being, but it's actually agriculture and food that's really driving a lot of these biodiversity declines. So these are more data from the IUCN, this time for all threatened species, so not just mammals. And we looked at the factors that are affecting these species, the factors that are driving population declines. And as you can see, it's the food system, this left-hand bar, which is really the biggest factor affecting threatened species across the world. It's the food system that threatens more species than anything else. Not only this, pressures from the food system are actually likely to increase a huge amount in the future. So a couple of years ago, myself and colleagues came up with some projections of where we think agricultural land is going to expand in the future. We can talk about exactly how we did this if you're interested. And what you can see is there's a big swathe of dark red across a lot of the world, but particularly in these high biodiversity tropical regions. Right? And that red is agricultural expansion. And so we're interested in the impact of this on biodiversity. So we took these projections and we overlaid them on maps of suitable habitat for around about 20,000 species of terrestrial vertebrates. And as you can probably guess, what we found was not particularly good news. So here, orange is
I can be a dick. I don't mean to be a dick.
No, I
think that was George. The orange on these maps show the habitat loss for all of the species that are in a cell across the world. And again, you can see there's basically a lot of orange across the world. And again, it's concentrated in the tropics, these areas where we really don't want to see biodiversity declines because they're so important. So here I'm showing you the mean losses to mean habitat losses to agriculture, but these actually conceal much more kind of worrying patterns. So here I'm kind of digging into the species that are really in trouble. So those amphibians, birds and mammals that are projected to lose at least a quarter of their remaining natural habitat. And as you can see, there are literally hundreds of them, right? Hundreds of species losing at least a quarter, and a fair number projected to lose about 3/4 or more of their remaining habitat. So these species are going to be at real risk of local or even global extinction. And this is just from agriculture. Right? Not climate change, hunting, or anything else. So that's a very quick run through the context. How do we deal with this? What are we going to do? How are we going to manage to feed people whilst not driving biodiversity to extinction? Well, there's obviously been an awful lot of work done on this, and a lot of research has focused on how we can try and mitigate the impacts of agricultural transitions. So this top picture here, this is a nice traditional farming landscape in Transylvania. You've got a huge amount of biodiversity on that farm, lots of non-crop habitat, lots of trees. And over time, that might transition to the much more intensive system you can see on the bottom, right? You've only got a single crop, you've not really got any non-crop habitat, a lot less biodiversity there. And so we've come up with a whole range of different interventions to try and kind of reverse this damage, right? We kind of know what we need to do, right? We need to include more non-crop habitats. We need to reduce cropping and stocking intensities. We need to reduce our inputs, maybe shift to agroforestry, to grass-fed beef. There's a whole list of things that we know how to do or know that we should do. The question is actually, how do we roll these out across farmland, right? Well, actually, I'm going to say this is completely wrong, and that a large amount of the effort that we put into trying to balance agriculture and biodiversity conservation it's not just misguided. It's not just not going to do much good. It's actually going to make things an awful lot worse. And instead, I'm going to try and outline what I think we need to be thinking about if we're really serious about conserving biodiversity over the next few decades, whilst also feeding people. So what is my grand and simplistic solution? I actually think we really need to focus on the agriculture part of it. The key to saving biodiversity over the next few decades is agricultural yields. So why do I say this? Well, I'm going to hopefully demonstrate that most species really need natural habitats to survive. The initial conversion of natural habitats to farmland is much more important than anything that happens afterwards. So we need to minimize that loss of natural habitats, and this means farming at as high a yield as is sustainable. And if we do this, these rapid yield increases across the world could actually safeguard huge areas of natural habitat. And it's that that's going to really bring the biodiversity benefits that we want. So that's probably not particularly controversial, but I think this means we actually need to think really, really carefully about anything that we do on farmland that either reduces yields or reduces production, or actually prevents or slows yield increases. And that's a lot of those interventions that I just listed. Importantly, however, this does not mean that increasing or maintaining yields is some kind of silver bullet, right? It's not going to solve all of the world's problems, kind of fairly obviously. But I really do think it is absolutely essential. We are not going to manage to conserve biodiversity in the 21st century unless we think very, very seriously about increasing yields across the world. Okay, that's the sort of the big setup. Let's go through these points in turn and hopefully try and convince you. So most species need natural habitats. If we go back to that IUCN data that I've already showed you, you can see that the food system is really important, but in particular, it's habitat loss. It's these blue bars that are really affecting the most threatened species. But of course, habitat loss isn't a kind of a single process, right? It takes a while and it has a number of different stages. So here we've got some natural habitats, the unpronounceable forest in Poland. That might then get converted into kind of a low intensity, relatively low yield traditional farming system. And then this might then transition into a much more intensive, higher yielding system. And so a question that's occupied a lot of conservation scientists and agroecological scientists recently has been whether transition 1 or transition 2 is more damaging for biodiversity. There's been a huge amount of kind of theoretical work and kind of modeling work, which doesn't seem to really reach a clear answer. However, there is a kind of an easy solution to finding this answer, and that is to go out and actually measure things, measure biodiversity in all of the different agricultural systems you can find and in natural habitats, and see where the big decline is. And fortunately, people have done this in a really broad range of agricultural and ecological systems across the world. So I worked in Yucatan in Mexico in livestock farming systems. We've got kind of agroforestry in Ghana. We've got cash crops in Uganda. There's mixed agriculture in Poland and the UK. A huge range of different systems across different parts of the world. But despite this variability in the systems we've looked at, actually a really, really clear result comes out of it. And that is that habitat loss, that initial transition from natural habitats to any form of agricultural land, that is much more damaging to most species than any subsequent intensification. So over 60% of the species we look at really can't survive in agricultural land. There are still a group of species for which intensification is worse, but these tend to be larger range species, and they tend to be more kind of habitat generalists. The majority of species really don't do well outside of natural habitats. And actually, this makes perfect sense from an ecological point of view, right? We know that most species are rare habitat specialists. There's no reason to think they would survive in agricultural land. Okay, so most species need natural habitats. Now, that means that for any level of food that we want to produce, the way we conserve most of those species is to minimize the area of agricultural land, right? We want to conserve as much natural habitat as possible. And this means we really need to farm at the highest sustainable yields, or increase our yields as much as is possible. And happily, this does actually look like it could safeguard really large areas of natural habitat. So I've already shown you this this figure before. This is projected habitat loss by 2050 under what we call a business as usual scenario. So this is when agricultural yields increase along historical trajectories. And for large parts of the world, particularly across Africa, this means really very slow increases indeed. But we also tested another scenario where we closed what is called the yield gap. So that's the gap between the potential yields that you could get and the actual yields that you are getting. And we modeled it so that we would close 70% of the yield gap by 2050. And for big parts of the world, this means really quite rapid increases in yields, actually. Then we reran the whole analysis. And what we found is that for some reason, the ocean changes color, but also we managed to protect an awful lot of habitat, right? There's a lot less orange on this second map than there is on this one. So simply by increasing agricultural yields, it looks like we can safeguard a lot of natural habitat whilst still providing all of the food that people are going to need in coming decades. So given that, I think we really do need to think very carefully about anything that either reduces our yields or reduces the total amount of production, because that's going to displace agricultural production elsewhere, or anything that prevents or slows yield increases. And this might seem kind of obvious. It's like, obviously, why would we want to reduce our yields or not increase them as quickly as we can? But actually, loads of the interventions that conservation scientists often kind of promote do exactly that. So 2 examples from very, very different systems. We've got an intensive wheat field, I think this is in France, with a lovely flower strip through the middle of it. And this flower strip is great, we get a load of benefits from it, but it is taking land out of production. So it's reducing the yield of that wheat field. And it might only be a small amount, maybe 1% of the field is lost, but 1% of all the arable land in Europe, say, is a huge area of land. And we're going to need to somehow get the food that's lost back. A bit more kind of controversial, maybe. The right-hand picture shows an agroforestry system. And these systems are being promoted pretty heavily, really across the tropics, as a way of farming more sustainably. You get more carbon, you get more biodiversity in these systems than you do in conventional agriculture. But I think this is actually really quite worrying, because these systems, they might be higher yielding than whatever they're replacing, but they are not as high yielding as conventional intensification. In many cases, sometimes they may be, but in many cases they're not. And so we have to be really careful about promoting a system that is not as high yielding as it could be, because that is necessarily going to displace food production. That is necessarily going to reduce the area of natural habitat that we can conserve. Now, there may be other reasons we want to do both of these things. There may be other benefits that we get, but we need to be aware that there is going to be this cost in terms of biodiversity, and actually in terms of carbon stocks as well, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm just saying being very, very aware of the cost that you are imposing on global biodiversity. And the same goes for kind of more broad approaches that may reduce production. So in the UK at the moment, there's a real push for protecting 30% of our land by 2030. This comes from the recent CBD discussions in Montreal. And I think it's maybe a bit of a misreading. So there is a global target to protect 30% of land for nature. But a lot of governments and a lot of other organizations are interpreting this as a national target. And this, I think, really is very worrying for a number of reasons. Firstly, the biodiversity that we could conserve in the UK, I mean, it's very important to me. I bloody love hedgehogs, but it's not globally important. It's relatively few species and very few actually threatened species. Not only that, land that we take out of production in the UK is likely to be really high yielding. We're really, really good at producing food in the UK. So that means that for every hectare we take out of production in the UK, we'll probably need a couple of hectares elsewhere in the world to replace that food. And these other parts of the world are likely, bluntly, to have a lot more biodiversity and a lot more threatened biodiversity. So we really risk displacing the impact of our food consumption to more important parts of the world, really. And there's a really nice paper by Richard Fuchs and colleagues that look at that in the context of the European Green Deal. Okay, so I do think we need to think very carefully about that kind of stuff. But I'm really not saying that increasing or maintaining yields is some kind of silver bullet. So first up, and this is something which people here will know far more about than me, there are real social implications of yield increases. Right, transitioning from this traditional agriculture to this much more intensive system, it's not just yields that are increasing, right? There is a total change in the kind of social benefits that you get from these different systems, the cultural benefits, the economic benefits, and where they're distributed. There's a huge sort of cultural and socioeconomic change there. And we need to be very, very kind of aware of this, cognizant of this. And I think we really need to work out ways that we can minimize disruption, and certainly minimize harm to kind of more traditional agricultural systems. Secondly, increasing yields doesn't necessarily mean that we'll get less agricultural land. So increasing yields doesn't automatically reduce habitat loss. And this is because we can have what are called economic rebound effects, where as you increase production, you actually increase demand as well. And this kind of rebound is likely to be particularly common for highly globalized food systems, i.e. the global food system, and also for products with a high price elasticity. So what I mean by this is products where if you produce more of it, people really do consume a lot more. And some examples of that would be, well, the four things I've got here: soybean, beef, cocoa, and coffee, right? If you make coffee cheaper by producing more of it, people do just drink a lot more coffee. And the reason that I've picked these four commodities in particular, they've got a very high price elasticity, and combined, they're responsible for about 70% of tropical deforestation. So we can't rely on a kind of a passive saving of natural habitats. Instead, I think we need to look for policy and economic mechanisms that explicitly link yield increases with natural habitat protection. And this paper led by Ben Phelan is sort of a first stab at doing this, but I think there's a lot more work to be done here to think about how we can actually save land through yield increases. Okay, last little bit. Yield increases also aren't going to be sufficient to save biodiversity in the 21st century. So this is that closed yield gap scenario that I showed you earlier. There's still an awful lot of orange on this map, right? A lot of species are still losing a lot of habitat. We did, however, look at another couple of scenarios as well. So we also looked at changing consumption patterns, so reducing food waste, shifting to healthier diets. And we also looked at global land use planning, which I'll be honest with you, doesn't really do very much. And you can see that there are regional differences in impacts here. So which approach looks like it's going to have the biggest impact. And also combined, these approaches do seem to be pretty good. If we put them all together, we do seem to be able to eliminate almost all agriculturally driven habitat loss across the world. So I think there is a definite pathway forward. Yields alone are not going to get us there, but, and I cannot emphasize this enough, yield increases really are completely essential. We will not be able to feed the world and save biodiversity in the next couple of decades unless we think very seriously about how we can use agricultural land that we already have to feed as many people as possible. Right, sorry, I was talking incredibly fast then. Hopefully that was intelligible. And yeah, if you've got any questions, it'd be great to take them.
Thanks. Thanks very much, David. Really interesting talk. And I think, judging from the chat, your attempt to be slightly provocative was probably quite successful. So I've been feverishly jotting down some questions from people who've been putting them in the chat. I'm going to apologize now if I've missed some really good ones, but it's been really interesting seeing what people have been thinking about in response to David's presentation. So I'll kick off with the first one that came in. I think that's fair enough, and it's from Gisa, and I think she's asking you to double down on your belief that if you increase yield, will you really safeguard habitats? Because if you think about the food system as a whole, isn't that really going to love this idea of increasing yield? And almost certainly it will encroach on natural habitat.
Yeah, totally. So that's, if I go back in my slides a little bit, that's completely right. So for some things, so I don't know, maybe wheat or potatoes, if you increase your yields enough, at some point you will kind of saturate the market, right? And then I think you will be safeguarding natural habitats. But that might happen on a global level. It's unlikely to happen on a local level, right? The place that produces the best potatoes or the most potatoes, that might be completely trashed. And then there's also this idea, particularly for really highly elastic, products with really high price elasticity. Yeah, it just may not happen. So that's why I say I think we need to explicitly link yield increases with natural habitat conservation, 100%. However, I guess I'd kind of flip that round and say, we're going to have loads more people in the world, and they are almost certainly going to be eating a lot more and potentially eating a lot more kind of inefficient products, you know, animal products and things like that. If we don't increase our yields, then we will 100% lose natural habitats. There's no way around that. So yeah, we've got to think about how we do that, and we've got to put in place policy mechanisms to maximize the benefits of yield increases. But if we don't do it, we are completely stuffed. And I think that's kind of where I've got to. It is a necessary, I can say necessary evil, it doesn't have to be evil. If we don't increase our yields, we will lose, you know, millions and millions of hectares of natural habitat, and loads of species will go extinct. That's where we're at. So this is the only option to get us out of that, really. But it's not enough on its own. So you're definitely right.
And kind of related to that and following on, Viviane Bardot wants to challenge you on this idea of increasing yield, because surely that will increase consumption in something termed the Jevons paradox. Yeah.
So that's the same point, really. So yeah, it may well increase consumption. You can kind of look at exactly how much you increase consumption versus how much land you save. So, you know, if you double your yields, do you necessarily double consumption? Seems unlikely, but you might do. But again, this just kind of highlights the need to link yield increases very explicitly with setting land aside as well. You can't rely on it happening passively, 100%.
Okay, I've got a couple of related questions here that are sort of challenging your idea that the worst impact you can possibly have is by getting rid of natural habitats to grow food. So at least in a UK context, you could argue that that's already been done. Mm-hmm. So, you know, what have you got to lose, really? And also, how does your proposition work or change when you are thinking about increasing biodiversity within a European farming context? So they're kind of related in that sense. And I think highlight that issue around regional differences and different drivers.
Yeah, so yeah, really good question. So I don't know if I can go all the way back to the map, but people have looked at this question in European context and in the UK context. So Tom Finch in the UK and Claire Feniuk in Poland. And kind of surprisingly, they actually found the same pattern. So the majority of species do best in as natural a habitat as we get. So Claire was looking at forests and also at kind of flooded grasslands. And there are just this whole suite of species there that do not survive in agricultural land. So I think the comparison that you want to be making is with restored natural habitats, right? The UK has very little kind of Caledonian pine forest or temperate rainforest left, but there is biodiversity there which isn't found anywhere else. I do think it's Claire's work in particular was really interesting because it also identified, and this might be the same elsewhere, but she kind of came along a little bit later. It also identified a whole suite of species that don't do particularly well in natural habitats and don't do particularly well in any kind of agricultural land which produces meaningful amounts of food. So a whole suite of species that need very, very low yielding agricultural land. And what she kind of suggested, and what Tom Finch has kind of picked up on in the UK as well, is that we probably need to think about that land not really as a food producing land use, but as land we manage in a very specific way for biodiversity. So we need to, well, my take on this would be, we need to produce all of our food as efficiently as possible in terms of land. And that gives us a chunk of land that we can do something with. And certainly in the UK and Poland, it looks like what we want to do with that chunk of land is restore some of it to natural habitats. We'll get a sweet species there that we will not get in farmland no matter what, and restore another chunk of it to these really low yielding agricultural systems. And we should view them basically as nature reserves, looking after species like things like wryneck in Poland, probably in the UK as well, these kind of forest edge species that just don't do well in the kind of deep restored natural habitats. So quick answer is we actually get the same result. More complicated answer is we want to do something slightly different with the land we set aside. But yeah, I do think we get exactly the same result here as elsewhere.
Thanks, David. Here's another really interesting question, I think, and it's basically getting at the idea that you don't just have land for producing food and land for not producing food, particularly now with respect to net zero targets. How do you feel the use of land to plant trees fits in with your ideas?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So places where we've looked, so Poland, Yucatan, and Ghana, even the really kind of agroforestry silvopastoral systems that we looked at, they didn't really store meaningful amounts of carbon. So compared with the natural habitats, they really weren't doing a kind of a carbon storing job. So I would probably say that it doesn't look like we can incorporate carbon storage efficiently in agricultural land. So if we want to be planting trees to store carbon, we need to be doing that on land that is set aside for that. There's a whole suite of questions which, again, other people here will be much better placed to answer as to whether we really want to be planting trees as the answer to all of our climate change woes. If we do that, it is super, super important that we do it on places that minimize the amount of food lost. So we really, really don't want to be planting trees on, prime agricultural land. And similarly, actually, I would also say solar panel farms and things like that. There is a really kind of worrying trend, I think, of taking agricultural land out of production to, plant trees or have solar panel farms. And if that land is good agricultural land, that's just a chunk of food that we're not producing anymore, and that's going to come from somewhere else. And that's probably going to result in habitat loss, which will have a much bigger carbon impact than with the benefits we'll get. So yeah, I think we need to be, again, very, very cautious about going down that route.
Great, thank you. A number of questions have come up with this idea of new technologies, new ways of producing food, like vertical farming or factory meats, and that's cropped up a few times. Have you had the opportunity to incorporate that into your models of sharing and sparing?
No, not at all, really, actually. So I think two things. So firstly, I haven't talked at all about how we'd actually do this. So, one of my big take homes is we need to really increase yields rapidly across big chunks of Africa. Like, we've been trying to do that, people have been trying to do that for like 50 years, right? And I'm not offering anything on the kind of the solution side, really. In terms of these kind of innovative new technologies, they might be really good. And what they would allow you to do is to produce large amounts of food on a very small amount of land, right? Which is good. That's what I'm after. We can minimize our agricultural expansion. Personally, I am kind of skeptical about the extent to which they can help us out, just because if you look at the parts of the world that are going to really need to increase their food production, they're largely some of the least economically developed countries in the world, right? That's where we will probably see large population increases, and where we'll hopefully see large amounts of economic growth, which is then going to drive greater consumption. These places are probably not going to be having vertical farms and lab-grown meat anytime soon, I don't think. I just don't think that's that's particularly feasible. So yeah, they might be one part of the puzzle, but honestly, I think getting large amounts of climate-resistant crops and fertilizers out to people, that's probably your go-to solution for a lot of this, would be my guess.
Thank you. We've got three minutes left. I think I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you a question now, David, as the chair. You had a slide that showed that things like birds and mammals are species that are really in trouble and most affected by, I think it was agriculture, was it?
Yeah, this one.
Interestingly enough, it's things like birds and mammals that don't really play much of a role in food production, and in some cases they're actually in conflict with farmers in the production of food. So how do you kind of resolve those sorts of issues? And that gets to maybe some of the social science aspects that you admitted you weren't really covering.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So most of the data that we have on this kind of stuff, so these are species that we looked at because we've got global data and they're comprehensively assessed by the IUCN. When we look at this stuff on a landscape scale, we have also looked at how some insects respond. So butterflies and dung beetles, because again, we've got good data on them. They show the same kind of pattern. So most species really do need natural habitats and don't survive well in agricultural land. So there's two things. On the insects, a lot of insects can be really quite beneficial. A lot of them can also be damaging for agriculture as well. Those beneficial ones, it might be that if we can find ways of bringing them in, so pollinators, if you've got a pollinated crop, or dung beetles, or natural pest control, there might be a way of bringing those into your agricultural land in a way that doesn't reduce your yields, right? So you maybe set a little bit of land aside, but the ecosystem services, the benefits that you get from setting aside that little bit of land actually covers the cost of it, kind of thing. In which case, 100% you should be doing that, right? Because that's gonna give you your highest yields, right? There's no trade-off there. In terms of what you were saying about the kind of potential conflicts between birds and mammals and agriculture, I think that's a really, really good point, actually. So if we go down the route of trying to incorporate biodiversity conservation within our agricultural land, I think there is a real risk that we're setting ourselves up for an awful lot of conflict with these species. So if you really want to have a meaningful representation of biodiversity in your agricultural land, a lot of that biodiversity is going to be eating your crops, or it's going to be disrupting things, or it's potentially going to be causing you harm. And I don't know whether we really want to be saying that that is the best way forward, right? So yeah, I think that's a sort of something that maybe we've not thought through completely when we're promoting these kinds of high biodiversity systems. It's that they are going to impose a cost on the people who are living in those systems and using those systems. So, from my kind of caricatured viewpoint that I've put forward here, I would say that's another reason to really think about separating your food production from your natural habitat conservation, from your biodiversity conservation, because that's the way that you actually minimize this kind of human-wildlife interface and you minimize that potential for conflict. Also, just a sort of question you didn't ask, but I'm going to go with it anyway. That human-wildlife interface, and particularly that livestock-wildlife interface, that is an absolute recipe for emerging infectious diseases and zoonotic diseases as well. So again, if you're incorporating a lot of biodiversity, particularly mammals and birds, within your agricultural land, there's a real risk that you're going to increase spillover events of exciting and horrible new diseases from wild species. So again, to my mind, that's a kind of a plus point for trying to raise your yields as much as possible and preserve as much natural habitat as you can, and keep the two things largely separate.
Thanks, David. I mean, that sounds like a topic for another seminar entirely. Believe it or not, we've actually run out of time. So I'd like to thank you, first of all, David, for a really interesting talk, really thought-provoking, and that's been reflected in the chat, where I'd like to thank everybody for posing questions, but also a really interesting discussion between today's participants as well. So I hope that will be shared among everybody. If you want to carry on discussing these ideas with David, then you can do so through the GFEI email address, which will be globalfood@leeds.ac.uk. So thanks very much, David. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much
for joining the seminar, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody.